As a beginner learning Maya, you will make a lot of mistakes and not know how to fix them. And the most frustrating thing I've seen a beginner experience is accidentally pressing a shortcut key and not knowing what they pressed and not knowing how to get back to normal viewport. Or maybe you press something and you did something to your object, but you just don't know what you pressed. And trying to find that way back and fix it is by far the most common issue that I see beginners face. So in this video, I'm going to show you some of the common beginner mistakes make, how to avoid them, and how to fix them. So the very first one is enabling subdivision mode. So usually you're working with an object and by accident, you press a key and your entire object, your entire mesh collapses. So I did this to a cube. Now my cube is a sphere. You work with a cylinder or anything else basically. Hitting a specific shortcut key, this will turn on subdivision mode preview or smooth mesh preview and collapses your object. So the shortcut key that most beginners press and they don't know how to get it back is 3. 3 is a shortcut key for subdivision preview mode. And in order to get back to your original object, you have to press 1 to reverse it and disable the smooth mesh preview. So subdivision modeling mode is a modeling method that makes your meshes look really good, smoothed out when they are subdivided. And in Maya, you can preview how your mesh will look when it will be subdivided by pressing the 3 key. And for game modeling, you will not be smoothing your meshes out. You're not going to be using subdivision modeling method. So whenever you see your meshes collapse, that means you press 3. And to get them back into normal mode, press 1 to go back to polygonal mode. There's another shortcut key, 2, and 2 just gives you a low resolution cage of the low poly object for the polygonal, and then also subdivides your mesh and gives you a smooth mesh preview at the same time. So basically you have 3 keys. 1 is the normal polygonal mode, 2 low res cage and a smooth mesh preview, and 3 just does a smooth mesh preview of what the subdivided model will be. So just simply press 1 to get it back. Number 2. Another shortcut key beginners press and not know they pressed it is soft selection. So I am in an object mode and I'm going to press a shortcut key to enable the soft selection. And you can see nothing showed up. And it's very easy to press it and have that happen. And then when you switch over to a component level, let's say you switch over to a face, and then you select a single face to work with, and all of a sudden you get this selection. You get this yellow to red, and anytime you move a single face, a bunch of other faces are being moved along with it. And this applies to an edge as well as to vertices. And then you try to move a vertex or 2 vertices or more vertices, everything else is being moved along with it. So this is known as a soft selection. And the shortcut key is B. B will toggle soft selection mode. And what soft selection does, it creates a soft radius, a fall off effect from your selection. So then you can modify your object at a more gradual level. So this is why you have a soft selection being made around a single vertex, and then it has a small fall off radius that will pull the other components along with it. So this is very helpful if you want to modify an object with a more fall off effect, a softer transition, rather than just pulling one vertex at a time like so. But the shortcut key is B, and this toggles the soft selection mode. And as a beginner, they often press it, not knowing that they pressed it, and they don't know how to turn that off. So to turn that off, whenever you see this selection being made, with this yellow to red transition, that means you have soft selection. Just press B to disable it. And you can also disable and enable the same option by double clicking on the move tool, open up the tool settings, and right here you have a tab called soft selection. And by pressing B, you can see that it's being enabled and disabled. And you can come in here, enable and disable it as well as you have some other options if you want to experiment with the soft selection settings. But B is your shortcut key to enable and disable. Number 3, not deleting history. So in Maya, anything you do to an object, a history is kept of what you did to it. So I'm going to quickly do a bunch of bevels, extrusions, maybe UV, and just build up some history to an object. So here I have an object that I did a bunch of extrusions. I just basically did something that we have some history built up. So if you select your object and you go to channel box, you will have history built up, all the steps that you've done to an object. Now this was a very quick method that I did to it, and you can see that I have some history built up. But if you continue working on this object, you will have a lot more history built up and kept for this mesh. And this history will stay here for as long as you model an object. And even if you shut down Maya and then reopen this file back up, this history will still be here. Now, periodically, you want to go ahead and begin to delete this history. You do not want to keep this. Having history built up on an object and not deleting it will often introduce a lot of problems into your file. First of all, not deleting history will keep the file size bigger, especially for more complex meshes. 2, you run into a problem of Maya corrupting the file or corrupting the mesh. I've seen some really strange things happen when a beginner doesn't delete history on it at all. And the next time they open up Maya file, the mesh either explodes and you cannot get it back to original shape, or sometimes I've seen it disappear, and other times I've just seen files become corrupted and unopenable. So as you work, you need to delete history and you need to remove all this junk right here that you no longer need. So to delete history, you need to go to Edit, Delete by Type, and delete your history on an object. There's a shortcut key, Alt-Shift-D, so you go ahead and begin to utilize this. And as soon as I delete history, all that junk, all that unneeded history will be deleted, and I can continue working on it. So as you continue modeling, UVing, or doing whatever else you need to do to an object, go ahead and begin to clear that history and make sure you delete it. Number 4, not setting up a project directory. So in Maya, you should set up a project directory to work from. This will keep your files organized. You know exactly where they're saved, and Maya understands where to go look for textures that you might be applying to your objects. It essentially keeps everything in one single folder and in specific subfolders, and Maya just knows where to go to assign certain things, and just makes your job a lot easier to keep everything organized. And I've seen a lot of beginners not even set up a project directory to work from, and they just continue using the default directory that is given to you on install of Maya. And I highly recommend that you always set up a project directory to work from whenever you are starting a new project. So the way you do this is you go up to File and then go to Project Window. Now I already have a current project set, but usually you'll have current project set to default, and it'll point to a random location where Maya was installed, usually inside your Documents folder on the C drive. So what you want to do is when you first launch Maya, is you want to set up a project directory to work from. Go to File, go to Project Window, click New, give yourself a current project name. This could be anything you want. Define the location where your project will be saved, and then keep all the project folder names that you see here as default. And this is how Maya knows into which subfolder to go to in order to look for textures, where to save your images if you render them out, and so on. And then you simply click Accept, and your Maya will be set to that project that you just created. And then you'll have a location to go to if you need to back things up or place textures that you're going to be working on into a specific subfolder within your project. And then next time you launch Maya, Maya will be already set to this project that you created. If you ever need to create additional projects, you go through the same step. Or if you need to set to an existing project that you've created before, you would just go to File and Set Project, and then choose a directory and a folder of an existing project that you already have, and you would click Set. And Maya will now point to this new existing project to work that you can work from. So do not work out of default directory. Go ahead, set up at least one project to work from, and that way you know where everything is going to be kept and everything will be nice organized for you to work from, save your files into, and back anything up you need. Number 5, you should save as an MA file type instead of MB. So let's say I want to save this file, and I'd go to File, Save Scene As. And by default, when you first install and use Maya and you haven't saved anything yet, the files of type right here on the bottom will be set to Maya binary, which is the .mb file type. And you want to change this to save all your scene files as Maya ASCII .ma. And the benefit of saving as a .ma file is the flexibility and versatility of the MA file types versus MB. So MB is a binary file, and the downside of an MB file is you cannot open it inside Notepad. And .ma is a file type that can be opened inside Notepad. It's a text file. So you can actually open up a .ma file as a text and make edits to the file. And the huge benefit of it is if your file ever becomes corrupted, you can still save some information and some work from it. And with MB files, you are not going to be able to do that. So here's the Notepad. And if I just take any of the scene files that I currently have, and all of them have been saved as MA, and I just simply left click, hold and drag, drop them into the Notepad, and it opened up as a text file. And everything I did to this object, that all that information is kept as a text. This is extremely useful, and MB files, you will not be able to do this. So you have more versatility, more flexibility, saving it as .ma, and just do this once. All you need to do is when you first launch Maya and you save your first scene, just switch files of type to ASCII, save it, and Maya will, from here on out, default to the .ma for you to save all of the rest of your scenes. Number 6, not understanding the XYZ gizmo and not orienting inside your viewport to model correctly. So whenever you create an object, let me go ahead and just delete these and create a new cube and make it larger. And whenever you select an object, hit W so you get to see the XYZ gizmo. So the first part of this is beginners don't understand the XYZ gizmo direction. So you have 3 arrows. Blue arrow is the Z-axis, red arrow is the X-axis, and the green arrow is the Y-axis. And in Maya, they have a specific direction. The Z or the blue is front to back. The red or the X is side to side, left to right. And the green, the Y, is up and down. And a lot of beginners may create an object and they don't pay attention to the XYZ gizmo, and they might be upside down. And I've seen some objects being created like this. The object is upside down and they begin to model it. And by the time they're done, the XYZ gizmo is in such a weird position that as soon as you see it, you know that this object was not modeled correctly in the correct world position and the correct XYZ orientation. So whenever you create a scene, here's what you should do. Make sure that whenever you create your object, create an object and then orient your camera position so you can model it correctly by making sure that the blue arrow, the Z-axis, is pointing towards you, pointing towards the camera, because this is going to be the front of an object. And then the red arrow is pointing to the right. That's going to be the side to side, the 2 sides of an object. And then the green arrow or the Y-axis is pointing up, and that's going to be the top and the bottom of an object. And this is how you should orient your scene every time you create an object and then you begin to model. So you know exactly where those directions are, and this is how you should set up your objects to create from. And one last little side tip. If you need to understand where the XYZ gizmo, so you kind of learn it better, and what the arrows and the colors mean, which axes they are, just come down to the bottom left. There's going to be a little gizmo appear inside the viewport, and it has letters. So Z is the blue, X is the red, and Y is the green. But creating your object, as you see here with the arrows pointing in these directions, will prevent a lot of problems later on as you model your objects. Number 7 is making the gizmo appear smaller or bigger inside the viewport or on your object. So this gizmo right here, if you hit W, this is your move tool. If you hit E, this is going to be your rotate gizmo tool. And if you hit R, this is going to be your scale. And this gizmo right here, you can change the size of this. And I've seen a lot of beginners have this way too big or way too small. And it becomes a little more difficult to control your objects if the gizmo is just bigger than the object itself or just too small for you to select and control. So the shortcut keys to control the size of this gizmo is minus and plus. If you hit minus, this will make the gizmo smaller. And if you hit plus, this will make it bigger. Small adjustment, but makes a big difference when you manipulate objects. Number 8 is resetting move, rotate, and scale gizmo tools. So sometimes whenever you move, rotate or scale an object, or whenever you are working with the component mode, such as faces, edges, or vertices. This gizmo right here, the XYZ position, either for move, rotate, or scale, may look odd or it just doesn't work the way you would expect it to. Sometimes this gizmo might be completely somewhere off in space, or you are trying to manipulate certain parts of an object and it's not working how it usually does by default. So for example, if I'm in a component mode and I'm just going to quickly change it to a component itself. So right now you can see the gizmo is working in world origin. So basically I am able to move this gizmo and manipulate these faces in the world space. And I'm just going to quickly change it off to a component. And you can see that the gizmo changes. And I am manipulating these faces in a component level. Sometimes you're switching things over and working with an object and you just notice the gizmo, just what happened to my gizmo? Why doesn't it orient in the way that I expect it to on the default object? So somehow one of those selections got switched over to another axis orientation. So the way to fix a lot of your problems with scale, rotate, or move gizmo is to reset those tools back to default. So to do this, you just simply select an object and double click on the move, scale, or rotate to bring up the tool settings. So let's just do for the move. And then you might have modified some of these properties, basically got screwed up somehow. And all you need to do is just reset the tool. So as soon as I reset the tool, you'll see that everything will go back to default. The axis orientation will switch back to world for move, and you reset the tool. And you can do the same thing for rotate. Let's double click. And I'm going to reset the tool for this. I'm going to close it, and I'm going to do the same thing for scale. So whenever your gizmo, XYZ gizmo for rotate, move, or scale seems off, doesn't work how you would expect it to, reset the tool for move, rotate, and scale, and that usually fixes a lot of problems. Number 9 is incorrectly modifying the pivot points. So being able to control the pivot point, where this gizmo appears on an object, is extremely important. There are hotkeys to modify this pivot point. So if you hold down D, this will enter you into pivot point manipulation or modification tool. And then I can just go ahead and drag this anywhere I want for my new pivot point to be. And if I let go D, then here's my new pivot point. And being able to control this is essential for environment design. However, beginners make one mistake of modifying this pivot point, and it's your ability to snap these pivot points anywhere on an object. So let me go ahead and undo, just bring back that pivot point. So by holding down D, you enter pivot point modification. And then if you hold down X, you can snap this pivot point on the grid. If you hold down C, you're able to snap this pivot point to an edge. And if you hold down V, you can snap this pivot point to a vertex. However, beginners make a mistake by modifying the pivot point and trying to snap that pivot point by dragging the pivot point itself. And they often rotate the pivot point, and they usually mess up the pivot point to the level such as this one, where now my pivot point is somehow rotated and my XYZ gizmos are pointing in a whole totally different direction. So the key is, if you're going to modify the pivot point and you're going to snap that pivot point to an edge, to a vertex, or to the grid, is not to drag the pivot point itself. So if you ever get something like this, you can reset the pivot point back to default by going to the move tool, by double clicking on the move tool to open up the move tool settings. And then here you'll be able to reset the pivot. So we fixed the pivot point by bringing it back to where it was originally. And then whenever you need to modify the pivot point, here's the proper way to snap that pivot point to the 3 parts of an object, either to a vertex, edge, or to the grid. So I'm going to hold down D, and to snap my pivot point to a grid, I'm going to hold down X, and then middle mouse click and drag, not on the gizmo itself, but on the grid where I want to snap that pivot point to. And middle mouse click and drag it, not left mouse click, but middle mouse click. If I want to snap this pivot point to an edge, I'm going to hold down D and C, and then middle mouse click and drag on an edge where I want to snap that pivot point. Again, I'm not dragging the pivot point. That's the number one mistake, is dragging this pivot point to somewhere you want to snap to. Instead, you just hover your mouse where you want to snap it to, and then middle mouse click and drag. And now I'm snapping to an edge. And if I want to snap this pivot point to a vertex, I'm going to hold down D, V, and middle mouse click and drag where I want to snap that pivot point to. And in this case, I'm snapping to a vertex. And then I'm going to let go of all the keys. And now that's my new pivot point that's snapped to a corner vertex. So 2 quick tips is being able to reset the pivot point inside the tool settings for the move tool. And then instead of modifying the pivot point by dragging the pivot point, that's the usually the number one mess up that you create. Instead of doing that, you simply hold D and then snap that pivot point by moving the mouse exactly where you want to snap that pivot point to, and then middle mouse click and drag, and that it will just take that pivot point and snap it exactly where you need it. This may take a little bit of time to get a hang of this, but this will prevent a lot of problems with your pivot points. Number 10 is having lost some parts of your interface. This is very common, and I'm going to show you how to get them back. So right now, this is the default. I still have all of my interface elements, but let's say you lost the range slider, or maybe the custom tool shelf, or the shelf itself is gone, or maybe this toolbar right here is no longer there. If you lose anything that you see by default and parts of the interface disappears, go to Windows, UI Elements, and make sure that all these are checked on. So I'm going to peel this off. I'm going to click on this bar at the top to make this a floating menu. So sometimes you may lose the shelf and you no longer have your shelf to have access to the icons, and they might have gotten disabled somehow. So by going to Windows, UI Elements, you're able to turn that back on, or you just check which parts have been disabled. Maybe the command line is gone, or maybe the range slider is gone, but you need it back, or maybe the toolbox. So you come in and you re-enable these UI elements. And another small, tiny little adjustment. Sometimes you may see in tutorials an extra icon appear, or maybe some of these icons don't appear at all. And you have them, but for example, the snap into grid options, let's say you don't see them. In Maya, if you see tiny little line like so, and there's a line with an arrow, this allows you to show and hide parts of the, in this case, toolbar. So if I go ahead and click on this line with an arrow, it'll open me up with extra options that were hidden. If you want to hide some of them, you just click on this icon again and it'll hide it. So if you see something or you don't see something, that's how you can hide and unhide parts of the menu by simply left clicking and opening that back up and hiding and unhiding certain parts of the toolbar. Number 11 is not being able to see your texture appear on an object. So at the moment, I have a material with the texture assigned to this object. And to see the texture appear on an object, you press 6. 6 is the shaded display with texture maps. And if I left click on this icon right here, texture it, enable it, I do have a material with a texture, but I don't see it. I'm going to double check to see if I have the material applied. I'm going to open up Hypershade. And here's my material right here, Lambert 2. And I'm going to middle mouse, click and drag and apply it to the cube. And again, nothing is showing up. And this is because you may have an icon enabled to view default material on. So if you come over here to the very top, this icon right here, this is what's messing this up. Right now it's enabled and it's using default material, which is Lambert 1. So I want to go ahead and disable this. Sometimes it gets enabled by default whenever you're coming over here. So if you left click on this to disable it, I can now see my material that I applied with the texture. And if you have it on, you will not see the texture, the shaded mode with texture maps on because of this toggle being enabled. So if that ever happens to you, just make sure that you have use default material turned off. Number 12 is objects disappear when you are further away from them or they begin to flicker. And this has to do with a camera clipping plane. So if your object is very large, you'll be zooming out so you can see the entire scene. And at a certain point, the entire object is going to begin to disappear and occlude. And also, at a certain distance, you're going to see certain flickering going on your mesh. And you can control this by adjusting the clip plane. So to fix this, come up to the view inside the viewport right here, left click on this, and choose select camera. This will select the perspective viewport camera, and it will display properties inside the channel box. However, we need to jump over to attribute editor instead. And the two properties you want to adjust is the near clip plane. That's the little flickering right here on the sides that you see. And the far clip plane. This is how far you are away from the object and your objects begin to occlude and disappear. So near clipping plane, I'm going to adjust it to 0.1 instead of 0.01, which is the default. Hit enter. That will fix that little flickering. And you can adjust this to whatever value you need until that flickering is gone. And then whenever you zoom out, if you want to increase the distance at where the far clip plane and all the objects occlude, just increase this number higher. So you'll be able to see more of the scene at the same time. Number 13, image planes do not appear in the viewport. So a common modeling method that you will use is you create an image plane, assign a photo on top of it, or a drawing, or some kind of a blueprint, and then you model from it. So this way you can have this image plane right here, and then you'll be able to see it and model to it so it's very accurate and represents the object you're trying to model more specifically, with more accuracy. However, sometimes your image planes that you know you have inside the scene don't show up. They completely disappear and you don't know what happened to them, but they are still there. So for example, I'm going to just enable a shortcut key and make it disappear. And the shortcut key is close to another shortcut key, and it's very common that you may disable the image plane by accident. And then if you go to Outliner, you have your image plane right here, but it just does not show up. So in order to check to make sure that you disabled it and you have to re-enable it, you go to Show, and then you come down and find image planes right here, and it's been disabled. And the shortcut key is Alt-4. So go ahead and re-enable it back on. And Alt-4 is very close to the hotkey Alt-5, which gives you wireframe unshaded. And by accident, a lot of beginners, they simply and unknowingly disable the image planes and they disappear from you, and that's how you re-enable it back. Just use Show drop-down menu and enable image planes. Number 14, curves don't appear in the viewport. And this is very similar to the image planes not appearing, but instead of image planes, curves don't appear in the viewport. So right now I have it disabled, and let's say usually you disable most of these by accident. And I'm going to create a curve. I'm going to go to Create, Curve Tools, and let's do an EP curve. And I'm just going to start drawing the curve. Let's say I want to model along this curve, and now I'm just creating the curve, and I'm clicking and nothing's happening. The curve is being created, but it just does not appear in the viewport. So when I hit enter, it creates the curve, but I just don't see it. If I go to the outliner, here's my curve. I have it, but it's invisible. So there is a shortcut key. Alt-1 will enable and disable the curves from being visible inside the viewport. So back up to Show, drop-down menu inside the viewport. If your curves disappear and you do not see them, but you know you have them, or when you create them and they don't appear, make sure you have Show NURB Curves enabled. So that way you can see your curves. Very common issue. And a lot of the visibility issues that you encounter, like certain objects not appearing, certain things that should appear inside the viewport but they don't, can be fixed by going to Show drop-down menu and just taking a look what has been disabled by accident and what you may need to re-enable. Number 15, objects disappear or don't show up inside the viewport. And you can see that the visibility issue with anything inside the viewport that's supposed to be there but it doesn't. It's a very common beginner problem. So in this one, it's about objects not showing up when you know they should be there, or whenever you create something, nothing shows up. So there are a couple of things, a couple of shortcut keys that enable and disable object visibility. So if you already checked under Show and everything is checked on, and you know everything is supposed to be showing up and everything is good here, then there are a couple of shortcut keys that you may have pressed in order to enable or disable visibility of certain objects. So if you select a mesh and you press H, H hides selected object. So if you had something there, you might have pressed H by accident and now the object is hidden. To bring it back, you can hit undo if you are close enough to, when the object was hidden, you can undo the H operation or the hide operation. But let's say if you cannot undo, you already moved on and you realize something is gone, you simply need to open up the outliner and take a look if the object still exists. Now, in this case, I'm going to open up one of the groups, and anything that's highlighted in darker gray, that means that that object is hidden. So in this case right here, this poly surface, that poly surface is hidden. So to make it show up, I would just need to select anything that's grayed out and hit H to bring it back. So H hides and unhides. It's a hide toggle for selected objects. If you have multiple things hidden and you want to just unhide all, let's say you have way too many objects, half of them are hidden, half of them are unhidden, and you just want to go ahead and unhide all, you don't want to have to check. You can get a lot of options of visibility and unhide and hide things inside the viewport by going to display and then going to show. And here you have a lot of shortcut keys to enable and disable, to toggle things on and off, as well as you can show everything. So if you have multiple objects hidden, you can just show them all by enabling display, show all. Another shortcut key that you can hide and unhide that you may not press, or maybe you forgot that you pressed it, is isolate select. So if you select an object and press Control 1, Control 1 will isolate selected object. Means it will hide everything from view. And then if you want to bring everything back, you just have to remember that you have isolate select enabled. And you can always check, it's going to be this icon right here, it's going to be enabled. Isolate select. So you can press either Control 1 to bring everything back, or click on this icon and it'll bring everything back into view. And again, the one way I like to check to make sure that I actually do have those objects is the outliner. Outliner will just list everything that's inside your scene. So you know that you have objects here. It's not just a single poly surface. And you just have to do your checks, make sure that isolate select is not enabled. Check that you have show enabled for everything that you want to see inside the viewport, as well as utilizing display, show, and maybe showing everything. And then one last part about isolate select, you can actually apply this to a component level as well. So just be careful. You could select a set of faces, press Control 1. This will isolate select only the selected faces. And then if you, let's say you save the scene, reopen it back up, all your objects are gone. You just have to remember to do your checks, and then you can bring everything back by toggling off isolate select. Number 16, not locking your workspace, your interface, and having menus dock all over and just ruining what you currently are looking at. So in Maya, you can pull off any panels, any windows, and dock them somewhere else. This gives you a lot of flexibility for the interface, but also can begin to dock certain windows when you don't want them to dock anywhere. So for example, if I go ahead and open up the hypershade, when you have a floating window and you try to move it somewhere else, Maya will begin to start docking it and place it somewhere else into the interface itself. And a lot of times it becomes annoying. You just want to move the window slightly, but you don't want to have it dock somewhere. So I recommend that you come up here at the very top right and click this lock icon. This will disable docking of any floating windows, so to prevent rearranging the Maya interface. Small adjustment, but huge help. And in addition to, I also recommend utilizing workspaces. So by default, you're working with the general workspace, but you can switch over to a specific pipeline workspace. It will rearrange your entire setup interface and only give you the menus that you need. So by coming up to the top right, you have Workspace General. This is what we're looking at. And if you left click and you can enable, for example, Modeling Standard, this gives you only access to the modeling tools and removes everything else. So you can see I don't have a range slider, the time slider, no animation controls. I can switch over to UV editing. It's a really great way to optimize your space very quickly and focus on whatever you need to work on. And then when you're done, of course, you can always go back to the general. Number 17, not building your objects to correct scale. This is a very common problem. So I already have my grid modified and I'm already building things to scale, but I'm going to go ahead and delete this cylinder and I'm going to reset my grid back to default, what you would see upon my installation. So I'm going to go to Display, Grid, Options, and I'm going to reset this. Edit and reset settings. and let's hit apply. And let me start a new scene. So when you come in, this is the grid you're gonna see. And if you don't change the default grid and know how large to build your objects, everything you create in Maya will be extremely small, and you have to scale things up to their real size. So if I create a cube, it looks completely normal based on the grid settings I currently have. And I can go ahead and start creating this. However, this cube is actually 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter. It is an extremely small size. And in Maya, you should start building to the correct size of an object. So the scale of a human, an average scale in terms of height, depth, and width is height is 180 centimeters, roughly about 6 feet, and depth and width about 50 by 50. That gives you a good range of a cube that matches a human scale dimensions. So if I select this cube, go to the input, and let's type in the size of a human reference. And this is usually the scale that I use to match my objects in terms of judging proportion, scale, and dimensions. Is I have this cube inserted pretty much into every scene, and anything I build, it helps me judge those proportions better and dimensions of an object I'm creating. So here's going to be our human reference scale box. So width will be set to 50, depth 50, and height 180. So this is a 6 foot tall person. So if I zoom back out, you can see that my grid is now extremely small. So that means we need to adjust our grid to make it bigger. And if you don't, then you're creating your objects way too small. Let's go ahead and adjust our grid now. Since we now have a 6 foot tall person right inside that viewport, let's go ahead and adjust this grid. So let's go back up to display, grid options, and change this. For length and width, change it to 1000. This is how large the grid is going to be in centimeters. Subdivision, always keep this at 1. And grid lines every so many units. This is the size of each grid unit, and I usually work with 10. So these are the dimensions that I keep my grid option set to, unless I need to come in and maybe modify the grid lines to so many units per grid unit in terms of centimeters. And maybe I need to increase the length and the width of the overall grid inside the viewport. But if you keep these values as they are, and you create a cube with the following dimensions, 50 by 50 in width and depth and height at 180, this will give you a much better representation of what the scale of the scene should be. And now everything you create, you can go ahead and start matching in size and scale to the human reference scale. So if I were to create an object, now I know how large I need to make it based on this height of a person standing inside the scene. Number 18 is resetting Maya preferences back to default, back to the factory install. So sometimes you mess up Maya so much or something stops working, and you may need to completely reset settings for Maya so you don't have to reinstall. You can actually clear your preferences and then reset Maya to what it was like when you first installed it, and that fixes a lot of problems. Now this is something you may want to do after you've exhausted all other options, because resetting your preferences will clear anything that you've set yourself. For example, if you have a custom tool shelf, this will be wiped out, or if you created any custom shortcuts, those will be gone as well. So this should be like the last thing you do if nothing worked up to that point. Now I'm using Windows, so the way to do this on Windows is what I'm going to show you. And you might have to look up how to do this for Mac if you're using Maya on a Mac. So first, go ahead and shut down Maya. Maya has to be closed. Then navigate into the Documents folder. This will be on your C drive. Then Documents, and then go into the Maya folder. Inside the Maya folder, you will see the Maya version you currently have installed. Now I have two. I have one for 2020 and 2023. So I'm going to go into 2023. So you want to go into the version that you have. And here's your preferences folder. This is the one you would want to delete. So what I recommend doing is make a copy of it, Control C, Control V, and then you delete this preferences folder completely. Wipe it off, delete it, and then relaunch Maya. When you do this, Maya will recreate a brand new preferences, which will be the factory install. And whatever problems you've encountered in Maya, most of them are usually fixed. So these were some of the most common problems that a beginner encounters and how to fix them. how to avoid them, so you can begin using Maya to model your environments. I also recommend that if you want to learn Maya very quickly and begin using it to model to UV, I have a very in-depth tutorial course, Maya Foundation, the home study course, that will teach you how to begin using, how to begin modeling, and how to begin UVing entirely in Maya. This tutorial has 18 hours of in-depth direct how-to instructions, and this will save you months of having to constantly look around for ways of fixing Maya to make it work. I tell you exactly what you need to know, what you need to focus on, so you don't waste any time. You can click on the link in the description, or it'll be within the blog post. Get the Maya Foundations course so you can learn Maya and finally begin modeling your own environments.